Republican presidential candidate Rand Paul recently made a campaign stop in Des Moines, Iowa, speaking to students at Drake University. The Kentucky senator spoke about foreign policy, the national debt, and the rights of LGBT employees. This is 25 Minutes.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It looks like Drake let you guys all out of class today. No class? How many of you are registered for the draft? Are women already registered? I didn't know that. But actually the Secretary of the Army said today they're going to start registering women as well. Or he thinks they may have to. But my question is, why do you think the government registers you at all for a draft? We don't have a draft. They've already got your Social Security number. Why do they want you to register? I'm thinking maybe they want you to admit your submission. Admit that you will go wherever, whenever they tell you. But you know what? You do get a choice. You get a choice on who you elect to run the country, on whether or not you'll go to war or not. This is the issue of the day right now, and it's becoming more and more profound and more imminent. Why is it an issue? Because you have virtually every other presidential candidate saying, we must have a no-fly zone. We must tell Russia they cannot fly over Syria or Iraq. What do you think that means? Right now, Russia's already flying over Syria and Iraq. Why? Because Syria invited them. Iraq invited them. So if you announce, as Carly Fiorina has, as Hillary Clinton has, as Rubio and several of the others have, that we're going to enforce a no-fly zone over an area where people are already flying, what do you think that means? That means we're going to shoot down Russian fighters. Well, we spent 70 years trying to avoid an altercation with Russia, trying to avoid an altercation with another superpower that has nuclear weapons. Who were the people that tried to avoid war? Ronald Reagan. Even though he's not always depicted this way by the liberal media, Ronald Reagan didn't shut down communications. He actually opened communications with the Russians. So we have people on the Republican stage now saying, we should not talk to Putin. Well, that's a recipe for disaster. We're going to all be flying our jets in about a 100 square mile area, and we're not going to have a discussion with Putin? That's a recipe for disaster. How many have read All Quiet on the Western Front? Still people are reading it. You remember in there the headmaster encouraged them to go to war, and they were supposed to be excited to go to war. It was supposed to be so patriotic and such a great thing, World War I. People today still dispute why the hell they fought the war. Millions of people died. The Battle of the Somme, 7 million people died. For what? War's a terrible thing. Does that mean we should be defenseless and not defend our country? Absolutely not. But it means we shouldn't be eager or reckless or wanting for war. War should be the last resort, not the first resort. When war comes, you'll be the generation that fights it. And it may not be a volunteer army. It may well be conscription. It may well be a draft again. Every one of you, man and woman, may be sent. But you have a choice. You have a choice who your leaders will be. And you must look and say, has it been a good thing, our involvement in the Middle East? We've already had one Iraq war. 4,486 soldiers died in the first war. Tens of thousands of others were wounded. It cost $1 trillion. And it's still going to cost more money to take care of these veterans, as we should. But did it accomplish something good? Are we better off because Saddam Hussein's gone? I don't know. Iran seems stronger now. Saddam Hussein was an enemy of Iran. In fact, to me, he was the counterbalance there. He was a dictator, but he was a Sunni standing in the way of expansion of the Shiite government of Iran. Who is Iraq's best ally now that we liberated Iraq? Who's their best ally? Iran. There are Iranian troops in Iraq. Who's their next best ally? Russia. Who invited Russia? Iraq. Recently, Russia flew troops and equipment into Syria Who invited them? Iraq said it's fine to fly over us. Syria invited them. And you may say, well, Assad is a terrible person. We must do something about terrible people around the world. But what if it's a variation of evil? What if there's a variation of evil on one side and the other? Assad has gassed his people. I've sort of flippantly said, if he were walking down the street, I wouldn't feed him. All right? He's a terrible person. We shouldn't give arms or food to Assad. But who's on the other side of the equation? ISIS. So they came to Congress in 2013 and they asked us for weapons for the Islamic rebels that were fighting against Assad. And I ask them the question now, then the same question I say now. I say, won't it be a great irony if the weapons we give to those rebels that we're back a year later having to fight against our own weapons? That's what's going on now. You hear about ISIS in the news, but where did ISIS get its weapons? From us, from our allies Saudi Arabia, from our allies Qatar. ISIS has $1 billion worth of U.S. Humvees they ride around in. U.S. Humvees. They pay their soldiers with $1 billion of U.S. cash they stole as well. They have anti-tank weapons that we gave to other Islamic rebels but were quickly snatched up by ISIS. You say, well, how did all these U.S. weapons wind up with them when we were giving them to the moderate rebels in Syria? Well, one CIA analyst put it this way. He said the only thing moderate about the rebels in Syria is their ability to fight. So we gave them these weapons and they were ineffective and they were immediately snatched up by ISIS. ISIS has our tanks. They've got our anti-tank weapons. I mean, it is completely insane. In the last presidential debate, they said, what will you do to defeat ISIS? And I said, well, maybe we ought to start with not arming them. Maybe we shouldn't fund them. The war over there is an utter and complete disaster, but there are evil people on both sides of it. Are you willing to go and fight Assad? Are you willing to fight to the death, their death or your death, to fight against a dictator in Syria, but to fight for Islamic rebels who also hate us? ISIS obviously hates everyone, Christians, particularly infidels compared to them or by their thinking. But are you willing to fight and die for that? Is there something over there that you can conceive of that's worth laying your life down for? Perhaps there's a variation of evil on either side. We have to understand that when we've been involved in the Middle East, it's often backfired. All right? Hillary's war in Libya, good idea? Bad idea. We toppled Gaddafi, who was a dictator, like Assad, a bad person. So we toppled Gaddafi, but what did we get in his place? Oh, we got the Arab Spring. Oh, that's right, the Arab Spring turned into the Arab Winter. And in the Arab Winter, we got chaos. So there's no government in Libya. It is a failed state. A third of Libya pledges allegiance to ISIS now. You've got Qatar in there with weapons. You've got Egypt in there with weapons. And you have a civil war. Once again, neither side probably likes America. Of the 1,500 groups fighting in Syria, do you think any of them would recognize Israel? I don't think there's one that recognizes Israel. Do you think any of them really like us? We try to get them to fight ISIS. We give them more weapons. But you know who they really want to fight? Assad. But there are 2 million Christians trapped in the middle. There are more Christians in Syria than any other place in the Middle East other than Egypt. But if you ask a Christian, ask any Christian in Syria who they would rather have, Assad, the dictator they know, or ISIS, the barbarians that they're getting to know. Not one vote. Every one of these Christians in Syria would say Assad, and they would pick Assad over ISIS. And yet we're going to go in and bomb both sides. There are people in the Republican Party, my party, who want to bomb both sides. Completely insane. We need better leadership. And you say, well, is one party better than the other? Sometimes they're the same. You know, you have Hillary Clinton wanting to have a no-fly zone, and you have Republicans wanting to do the same thing. The same nonsense, the same bad planning, the same thing that drug us into the first Iraq war. Who voted for the first Iraq war? Hillary Clinton. Now, she later on backpedaled like everything else. Once she finds out something's unpopular, she flips to the other side. In Syria, we've said, well, we're going to fund and train these Syrian moderates. So we spent $250 million to train 60 of them. Over $4 million per fighter. And you know what we did? We sent them back into battle, 5 at a time. Who sends in an army of 5 people? They were captured in 10 minutes, stripped of their weapons by al-Nusra. Who is al-Nusra? It's another name for Al-Qaeda. They're radical Islamists in Syria. And people say, well, why would we be fighting with Al-Qaeda? And they tell us, oh, that's what we must do now. We must fight with Al-Qaeda against ISIS, because there are 2 variants of radical Islam, but we can live now with Al-Qaeda. And I'm like, weren't they the people who attacked us on 9/11? Now we're going to fight with them? And then later on, they're going to love us. We're going to have a big hug. We're going to do a big group hug afterwards, and al-Nusra is going to love us. No, they'll kill us when we turn around. Maybe there is no answer. There's another war going on in Yemen. In Yemen, you have these Houthi rebels, and Iran is supporting them. You have these other Sunni Muslims, and Saudi Arabia supporting them in Washington. Boom, boom, boom. The war drums. Everybody beats the drums and says, oh, we got to get involved in Yemen because Iran is in Yemen. And it's like, the Iranians are killing Al-Qaeda. Maybe we should buy popcorn, you know? Maybe sometimes there isn't an answer, and maybe sometimes we just shouldn't be involved. Does that mean we would retreat and sort of get behind our fortress America or get behind our oceans and do nothing? No, I think we do need to be engaged, diplomatically engaged. And it's funny how people use these terms. Some people say, oh, you're talking about isolationism. No, I'm not. In some ways, they're talking about diplomatic isolationism. Not talking to Putin is a form of isolationism, a form of diplomatic isolationism. But you will have a choice, and a lot of this is up to you. You're the ones who fight the war. So think long and hard about it, whether you're ready to volunteer to go to another Iraq war. Think long and hard about whether it would be good for America and whether you're up to the task and this is something you think we ought to do, because your vote will make a difference. It's also very expensive. People say, well, oh no, it's just the Democrats' fault. That's why we have this horrendous debt. Republicans will tell you that we borrow $1 million a minute, that we have an $18 trillion debt, and it's all the Democrats' fault. Guess what? It's both parties' fault. They point fingers, they pretend to disagree, and people are always complaining, oh, we need more civility in Washington. If you guys would just hold hands and sing Kumbaya, everything would be okay. The problem's actually the opposite. In Washington, we have too much holding hands. We have too much Kumbaya. The right says we need more money for the military, and the left says we need more money for domestic welfare and domestic spending. You know what happens? They always get together and raise spending. It's both parties' fault, and people in both parties are bankrupting America. Who are they stealing from? They're stealing from your future. Some say that the debt is costing us 1 million jobs a year. So you need to be aware of this, because this is your future they're borrowing from. I think we need a different way. I think we need a way in which the government doesn't look at your phone records. The government doesn't put you in jail for nonviolent things like marijuana. And the government doesn't send you to wars that don't seem to have purpose. I think we need to believe in the entire Bill of Rights. You'll hear Republicans who talk about the Second Amendment. I defend it as well. Don't come into my house unannounced, or you'll discover that I do. But also defend the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment says the government can't come in your house without a warrant. I also defend the Fifth and Sixth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment says the government can't take your property without just compensation, without due process. By regulatory fiat, by regulatory edict, President Obama is taking your land. There's something called the waters of the U.S. 97% of the land in Iowa now is under federal jurisdiction. How do they justify this? They say, well, if a bird, a migratory bird, could have landed in the Great Lakes and now lands in your backyard is connected to the Great Lakes. So therefore, we can regulate every parcel of land we want. Did Congress approve of this? No, he's just doing it on his own. That's the greatest problem we have in our country, is this collapse of the separation of powers, where the executive branch is consuming all of this power and your representatives don't get any vote anymore. The Sixth Amendment says you have a right to a trial by jury. And you say, well, who could possibly be opposed to that? An ancient right, a right that even precedes our dawn in English history. It goes back to Greek and Roman times, the right to be tried by a jury of your peers. Well, we had a debate in 2011 over this in the Senate, on the Senate floor, and we debated back and forth over whether an individual American citizen accused of a crime in the United States could be indefinitely detained without a trial, without a lawyer. And I was incredulous, and I'm having this debate, and I don't like to name names, but it was the senator from Arizona. And I said, do you mean an American citizen could be snatched up and sent to Guantanamo Bay without a trial, without a lawyer? And he said, yes, if they're dangerous. And I thought to myself, my goodness, who would give such responsibility to one person? And it begs the question, really, who is that person? Who's the person that gets to decide who's going to be snatched up, who's innocent, who's guilty? And I thought in that moment of the times when we've gotten it wrong, when we incarcerated 100,000 Japanese during World War II simply because of the way they looked, when we wiretapped the phones of civil rights leaders in the 60s and those who protested against the Vietnam War without any due process, without any Fourth Amendment, without any approval from a judge, when we got it wrong. I thought of the time when Richard Jewell was accused of being a bomber. Many of you, this happened before you were born, back in the 90s. You don't even remember the 90s. He was accused of bombing Centennial Park in Atlanta, Olympic bombing. Everybody said he did it. All of the television cameras said he was guilty. Within hours, his name was plastered everywhere across the country. He was guilty because he fit the profile. He wore glasses, and I see a few of you. He had a backpack. I see a few backpacks. He was solicitous to the victims. I always wondered about that. He was thought to be a bomber because he was kind after the bombing. But he fit this profile, and they all said he did it. But the only problem was he didn't do the bombing. That's why we have the Bill of Rights. Imagine if Richard Jewell had been a black man in the South in 1920. What must have happened to him? The Bill of Rights, the right to a trial by jury, is to protect minorities. And people say, well, I'm not a minority. You can be a minority because of the color of your skin or the shade of your ideology. You can be a minority because you're an evangelical Christian. You can be a minority because you teach your kids at home. You can be a minority because you're an atheist. Or you can be a minority because you believe in the Constitution. The Bill of Rights is about defending particularly those who have had an unorthodox or unpopular idea. The Bill of Rights isn't so much for the high school quarterback or for the prom queen. The Bill of Rights is for the least among us, for the least popular among us. And it's an amazing thing, but we can't give it up. We can't in our fear say, oh, just take our liberty, make us safe again. And then some people say, well, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. It's kind of a step down from innocent until proven guilty. We have to decide whether or not our freedom is precious enough to defend, whether or not it's precious enough to fight for. I don't think you're necessarily fighting for your freedom if we go back over to Iraq. But there is a fight here. It's not so much a physical fight, but it's an intellectual battle for the way your country goes. I'll leave you with one last story. The Sixth Amendment also says that you have a right to a speedy trial. Khalif Browder was a 16-year-old black kid who lived in the Bronx. He was accused of a crime and sent to Rikers Island. He spent 3 years there without a trial. No trial, never convicted. 2 of the 3 years he was spent in solitary confinement. He was beaten by gangs, beaten by guards, and he ultimately tried to commit suicide. He was finally released, but he could never get over the prison experience. He was never convicted. He was accused of a crime by somebody who wasn't even in the country legally, who fled back to Mexico. But he finally did commit suicide a few months ago. And when I think about that, I think about, that's not the country that I believe in. That's not the kind of country I want to represent. I don't want to represent a country that can't obey the Bill of Rights, that's putting people, young people in jail for nonviolent crimes, sometimes without a trial, sometimes letting them linger there. None of you probably would have been left in jail. Your parents would have figured out a way to get out. But this was a poor black kid from the Bronx, and he couldn't get out of jail, and he was kept there without bond, or with a bond that he couldn't make. I want to be the party, and I want to be different than we've been in the past. I want to be someone who says, you know what? I want to defend everybody, rich, poor, black and white. I want to defend everybody and defend the entire Bill of Rights. I want to be the one who says, you know what? I will with passion defend the Second Amendment, But I want to have the same and equal, if not greater passion to defend the Sixth Amendment, to defend the justice for all, no matter where you came from. I hope you want to be part of that, and thanks for coming out today. Thank you. I'm told I have a plane pretty quick to catch, but I can do a few, and we'll try to do mostly students. Right here.
The Justice is Not for Sale Act calls for an end for for-profit prisons and the immigrant detention mandate. Would you be supporting this legislation?
I'm not familiar with it. Describe what's in it again.
It calls for an end to for-profit prisons and the immigrant detention mandate.
I don't know what necessarily right offhand what both of those are. I do know that we have some for-profit stuff in the prisons that is a problem, where people can't afford the ankle bracelets that they're told to get, and because of that, they end up having longer prison sentences because they can't afford the punishment that's been given to them. But I'm not sure about the rest of it, but I will look at it. Yes.
One of the global issues we face today is the emergence and subsequent corruption of transnational corporations. I know it's been a key topic in Democratic debates, but can you weigh in your 2 cents about how to control and regulate transnational corporations?
The question is whether or not corporations have too much influence and too much power in our political world. This is a debate that's been coming up back and forth for a long time. And people talk about it in terms of like campaign finance reform. How can we try to get special interests out of our government? One of the important things to remember is that the reason people purchase influence, what does Donald Trump give millions of dollars to Democrats and millions of dollars to Republicans? He told us, it was in the Wall Street Journal, he says, I buy politicians because I want them to do whatever the hell I tell them to do. So he buys politicians because the government has power. I think government has too much power. So the more powerful government gets, the more likely people are to try to purchase the influence of government. So one of the answers is a more broad answer, is that we need to make government smaller so nobody wants to purchase influence so much. The other answer, though, is that I think there could be some rules. I think I'm better off with this. Can we go back to this? Have them go back to the tie. The other thing about special interest that I think we could do, they've tried passing limitations on contributions, and it's been deemed unconstitutional. Actually, I agree with that. I don't think you should limit people's speech. But I think there is one way you could do it constitutionally. If you're a contractor for government and you get a $1 billion contract, it's a contract and you're being given money, I think you could make a condition of the contract that you sign that you won't lobby government at all. Now we try to stop it by saying you won't use any of the money I give you to lobby, but you've got plenty of other money that you then, money's kind of fungible and mixed together. And so a lot of big companies that do business with government are able to use some of that money to go lobby and get more. Some of these big corporations have 50 lobbyists. Some of them have 100 lobbyists, but they're ones that are usually getting stuff from government. And I divide the difference between corporations who just want to be left alone, lower taxes and less regulation, which I think is a legitimate complaint, from those who are trying to get business with government and they're taking their money to lobby to get more of your money. So I would separate it out that way. I think I've got time for one more.
Make a connection back to the for-profit prisons have lobbyists.
Right here.
Yeah. Do you think an employer should be able to fire an LGBT employee because that person is LGBT?
I think really the things you do in your house, we could just leave those in your house and they wouldn't have to be part of the workplace, to tell you the truth. These are very difficult decisions on what you decide will be employers' decisions and not. And it really isn't so much about that question as it is about that it sets up a classification or a class of people who can now sue. You see what I mean? So what happens is it sets up a whole industry for people who want to sue. So if you happen to be gay and you get fired, now you have a reason you can fire. But it's almost impossible sometimes. People don't put up a sign and saying, I'm firing you because you're gay. It's something that's very much disputed. And so I don't know that we need to keep adding to different classifications to say that the government needs to be involved in the hiring and firing. I think society is rapidly changing, and that if you are gay, there are plenty of places that will hire you. And I would say the vast majority of corporations already privately have manuals or work manuals that say that they don't discriminate in any way, and I think that to be the fact. So I'm really not for having the government more involved in this situation. Thank you all for coming. I had to run to catch my plane.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism